Well, once more, good afternoon. It is so nice to have all of you with us, particularly on this holiday week. We appreciate your time. My name is Dan Worry. I'm the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which is located in Cary, North Carolina, just outside of the Raleigh-Durham area. And for the benefit of any of you who may be new to our programming today, the Institute is the creation of our chairman and namesake, four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. We serve as an education policy support to governors and state legislators and other high-level state elected leaders. And we cover the full spectrum of education policy, beginning prenatally through early childhood and K-12 and on up into post-secondary and the workforce. But today we're focused on early childhood and going to have a conversation really about one of the most timely and important issues in the field. You know that among many consequences of COVID is that we know that there are many thousands of young children. I don't know that we have an exact number, but likely tens of thousands, if not more, whose families opted out of group-based early education and care over the past year, including the fact that many states have seen very marked drops in enrollment in both pre-kindergarten programs and in kindergarten itself. There was a recent NPR poll of 60 districts in 20 states that showed an average kindergarten enrollment drop of 16% during the current year. Another analysis that looked at 33 states showed that of the entire enrollment decline experienced by K-12 school districts, 30% of that over the past year has been attributable to kindergarten alone. So we know that the transition into kindergarten can be challenging for many children and families, even under the best of circumstances. It's an unusual time as we're transitioning into a new setting, but this coming year promises to be especially unique, not only with potentially record numbers of children enrolling as we reabsorb many of those children who sat out during COVID-19, but we also recognize that the school readiness of those children may almost certainly be impacted by things like the absence of social interactions with peers and structured learning experiences that they might have otherwise been exposed to during preschool experiences. So today our topic is school transition and how we might best plan ahead for what could be a somewhat unusual year in that regard. I'm joined today by a terrific panel. Dr. Kathy Gaston is the Executive Director of Friends of Children of Mississippi, which is a large Head Start program. Laura Bornfriend is the Director of Early and Elementary Education at New America in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Sharon Pepakaya is Associate Superintendent of the Appoquinimink School District in Newcastle County, Delaware. Welcome to all of you. Dr. Pepakaya, I wanted to start with you, with that sort of introduction as grounding to our conversation. I'm curious to know a little bit about, what has your school district experienced during COVID-19 during this year? Have you seen changes in kindergarten enrollment, and what are you expecting here as we look toward the 21-22 school year?
Thanks, Dan, for having me. I'm excited to be here to not only share, but learn from other colleagues in the field. What we saw this year, starting off in the beginning, was when we went straight to virtual was a decline in our families, and they were opting for more private school or homeschool options because they were able to still continue with the learning. And in the private school, what we saw were students were still able to go. So we did see a decline. We usually have a robust kindergarten registration in person. That's a big event. And because we went to a virtual option and online, we did see, again, the decrease because the information parents weren't getting there face-to-face. But we tried to do the best we could with having online options for our families. Because our school district is still in a growing community, we still have developments growing. We didn't see a decline as some of our neighboring districts did, because we still have a lot of families coming into the neighborhood and into the district for the schools and just into the area because it's still growing. So we didn't see that much of a decline, but we still, we did see that going for the private and homeschool options.
That's terrific. I'm curious to know, Sharon, with the more virtual option this year, how did you address transition at the beginning of this school year with young kids?
So our district is unique in that we have standalone kindergarten centers. So we have three kindergarten centers, bringing another one on, which, to my statement, another one we had to build because of the growth that's coming online in the fall. So we do have 3 kindergarten centers, and we have standalone pre-K center, which houses our 3 and 4-year-olds. So what we did at the very beginning is did the fact finding to see who was still interested when we were ready to go into a hybrid model, would like to come in. And then we did a lot of drive-throughs, a lot of going door to door to give the students and the families the materials, everything that they could possibly need so that lessons could be the same as they were. So a lot of the manipulatives, teachers bagged it up. And so I really have to give kudos to the staff and the administrators for continually coming up with ideas and their creativity in going out to families and getting things to them to keep things, as normal as possible.
And are you expecting, Sharon, an increase in your kindergarten enrollment this year above and beyond what you would see in a typical year?
We are, just because we're growing. So we're adding, another center that's going to have both pre-K and kindergarten in it. So we are still growing, and we're still, we just started, we're on spring break now, but right before the break, we did invite families in coming from the 2-day model of hybrid, extending that to 4 days. So right before the break, we now have families that are coming in 4 days. And as time moves on, we're seeing more and more families that are wanting their students to come back into the building.
That's great. Dr. Gaston, I want to turn to you at this point and ask sort of a similar question. Friends of Children of Mississippi is a nonprofit that provides Head Start and early Head Start services in 20 counties in Mississippi, much of it in rural communities. We know Head Start is really sort of the master of transition. It's been such an important part of the program, ingrained over many years. Talk to us a little bit about how your services looked maybe a little different during COVID-19, and how you've handled transition within your Head Start program. And Dr. Gaston, you're muted.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, thank you, Dan. Our transition activities did change last year. Once the pandemic hit, many of our major transition activities we were no longer able to do. So one of the main things that we would do with our children for transitioning, and that's more than one visit, they would cross-visit the public schools that they were going to be going to, the kindergarten classrooms, meet with kindergarten teachers, and also have the opportunity to intermingle with kindergarten students. We were not afforded this opportunity because many of the local schools, we all canceled, we closed, and we started to depend on a path to just doing virtual connections. So we started working through virtual connections with that. But this year, also last year, we partnered with Waterford Upstart. This gave many of our families an opportunity to work with their children to continue their school readiness growth. Waterford is a program that provided laptops and internet services free to our families, and it continued to September. They also were provided a learning coach, which we call a family education liaison, and this person worked directly with the families. Now, not all of our families were able to connect to Waterford, but we focused on those 4-year-old children transitioning to the public school to get them to continue their growth and development. So this was a great help for us because all of a sudden everything was closed, everything was gone. So we plan to partner with them, helped us a lot. This year we are looking at through virtual school readiness teams, education advisory teams. We're collaborating together, and on these teams are public school administrators, educators, preschool and kindergarten, Head Start teachers, and parents are working together for the transition of our children to the public school for this year. We're also planning, hopefully, to have a face-to-face summer program, and some of our public school partners have agreed to sharing that financially, as well as utilizing kindergarten staff to work alongside our Head Start teachers for 4 to 6 weeks this summer to help your children ready. This will not take it to all of our children, so we still will be doing some virtual summer programming with some of our children who are going to be transitioning to public schools. Also, we are doing kindergarten screenings through virtual home visits or some face-to-face, taking into consideration social distances and other health and safety practices. We also conduct Zoom sessions, and we got all our teachers have phones, and they have phone pals with the parents. So a lot of communication is occurring that way. Also, transition questionnaires are being completed by parents. We either send them to them or we do them virtually. And this helps us to address any questions that questions or concerns that the parents may have about their child's next learning environment. Also, we can set goals. Goals are being set at these meetings. Cross visits, virtual tours of the classrooms, the cafeteria, computer rooms, school buses. We're coordinating virtual tours. Also, teachers telling stories to our Head Start children about coming to kindergarten. We also are able, for some of the kindergarten children, can do these virtual tours together, so they're able to see each other and have conversation with each other. So this has been very important for what's going on with the transition.
That's terrific.
With the phone pals and the Zoom sessions, virtual parent-teacher conferences. We also are focusing on children who are transitioning with disabilities, so we're working closely with our school districts with that, and some services are being provided in the home for those children. Orientation videos are being developed with elementary teachers, principals, Head Start teachers, just kind of help the family to understand what happens in transition, what's expected in transition, talk about their rights and their responsibilities, kindergarten policies and procedures, so they're sure of those things. For those parents we can't Zoom with, we mail out materials and we have those phone pal conversations. So a lot of things are happening that we're doing face-to-face. Now we're finding other ways to do that. Even with the children, when we began this year, we did virtual classroom, Head Start classrooms, so that the children can see the classrooms that they would have been in. So kind of give them a feel of what's going on. So working closely with families, we also have to make sure that we realize families have more than one, most of them have more than one child. So the time that we spend, we have to maximize that time, but not take up all our parents' time. So we work together. If it's a family service worker and a teacher that needs the conference to have information, we try to pool that together and get all the information to the parent at one time.
Kathy, that's great. I think one of the exciting things to me about having these online conversations over the past year has just been how exciting it is to see how school districts and early childhood programs across the country have just really risen to the moment. I think all throughout the pandemic, things obviously look a little different and maybe conducted a little different, but it really has been inspiring to see how early childhood teachers and administrators across the country have really worked and with a lot of success to make things as normal as possible during a very unusual time. So it's exciting to hear about all you're doing at Friends of Children. Laura, I want to turn to you a little bit. I know even prior to the pandemic, you and I were having some conversation about some work that you had done at New America, highlighting best practices in kindergarten transition sort of generally. But I'm curious to let you share a little bit at this point about kind of what you learned in that process in terms of what's important for school transition, but also what you're thinking about now as we approach what could be kind of an unusual year.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. As you said, over the last several years, New America has published work on improving the transition for children and their families into kindergarten. I've seen this as a really important issue. I know you laid out some things at the top, but I think about a couple of reasons this is important. We know children are not entering kindergarten with the same previous experiences. And without knowing and understanding children's previous experiences, there's really no way for schools and teachers to meet them where they are. And then second, kindergarten in many places is, often not designed and delivered in the way that young children really learn best, the 5 and 6 year olds. And kindergarten is in that middle of the early childhood continuum, which extends up to age 8. And when it can be more connected and aligned to children's previous early childhood experiences, that's just all the better and helpful to create a smoother transition. And, kindergarten can be that formal start to, public school and really build on children's previous experiences in a way that intentionally incorporates things like play, discovery, social interaction with content, similar to the way we think about experiential learning and things like that in the older grades. With others, as you said, also like in any given year, ensuring a smooth transition is challenging, but of course, in the middle of this pandemic, it's, all the more so. And so last, summer, when schools and districts and states were really grappling with whether and how to reopen, I didn't want that transition planning for new kindergartners to fall by the wayside. So, a colleague and I, really looked again at places that we had elevated in the past, places like Georgia, Chicago, and others, to find out how they were thinking about transition into kindergarten then. And, there was a mix of uncertainty, but lots of virtual kinds of different ways of doing things, with some in-person opportunities, utilizing the outdoors when that made sense, finding good ways to connect with families on Zoom. And I think that that's just become the norm now for a lot of us. And, a little just side note, but I think even when we go back to in-person, there's some ways that virtual opportunities will still be a good way to connect teachers across different systems and families and even kids when possible. So when I think about transition, we know that there's the mix of like low touch activities, high touch activities, and then there's also this more system level work that focuses on the connecting and aligning what happens before kindergarten with kindergarten, and then also what comes after. And so thinking about transition in that way means we're not just focused on a single point in time, but also thinking more continuous. And so, activities like those meet and greets and readiness packets and summer programs and family orientations and classroom visits are certainly helpful. And those are the helpful, discrete, like one-time transition activities. And equally important is that ongoing alignment and relationship building activities that are more time and more resource intensive. As I think about fall 2021 and beyond, I'm thinking about really who will enter kindergarten and first grade in the fall, what their previous year looked like. Next school year, even being back in person, will be really different. We all know that. Educators need to be equipped and prepared to address children's different learning needs and developmental needs, and classrooms are going to need to look differently and feel differently. So in the short term, as we think about transition in next year, I'm thinking about, what kind of professional learning and resources are districts putting into place, so teachers feel ready. I'm also thinking about this moment and the future as time for transformation, and really addressing that question, like what is needed for schools and community early childhood programs to work more closely together to support that transition, build relationships to share data, align curriculum, instructional strategies, assessment, approaches to discipline, all those things to create some more continuity for children and families across pre-K and kindergarten. And of course, like what's the role for states to encourage that kind of work, and how can the influx of federal dollars really support it right now? I think that alignment work is integral to successful transitions, and it's something we've been talking about for a long time, but still not commonplace. So I think it's even more important now, and I think this is a moment where big change is more possible, and so that's what's on my mind for going forward.
That's terrific, Laura. Laura, thank you. I want to invite everyone who is viewing today and remind you that we will, a little bit later in the hour, take some of your questions. So if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the panel about transitioning children into school after a year of quarantine, please feel free to use the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and plug your questions in there, and we'll try to get to some of those in just a couple of minutes. It's interesting. When we think about transition, I think a lot of times we leap immediately to the transition of the children themselves and the experience that they'll have. But I definitely recognize, as a former kindergarten teacher myself, the importance of the transition process for families as well, and the opportunity there right at the beginning of the kind of public school experience to create really strong bonds between home and school and teachers and parents in particular. And I'm wondering, several of you have already raised some of the new virtual options that we have been sort of forced into in a way this year, and wondering if in some ways they may be less than optimal in terms of working with young children, but wondering if you would think that some of the exposure to things like Zoom and FaceTime and everyone's greater familiarity with using those might actually be kind of a silver lining in the pandemic, in terms of really meaningfully connecting schools and teachers with families. Is that something that Dr. Gaston, you mentioned, having cell phones and making those resources available. Have you seen improvements or changes at all in sort of how your teachers are able to connect with families during the pandemic?
We certainly have, and not only that, the connection that our parents, being the primary educators of their children, we see them taking on that responsibility. They're sharing lots of information, things that, although we have the connection with the teacher and the parent, but the parent is feedback into us about what those things, those lessons that they're teaching with their children, all the activities that they're engaged in, and really enjoying that part of their primary educator. And our teachers have more closer relationships, especially those with the phone pals, because they have their phones, they can make those connections. And all parents are not available to do Zoom, but most parents have a phone that they can make those connections. So we find that our parents are sharing more, and our teachers are enjoying watching parents do those things with children. So that's really great.
Just thinking back to my own years in the classroom, I mean, certainly there were some parents who were very involved that I would see very regularly, but truly a very large number of families that I occasionally would see in passing, but very few families that even as a kindergarten teacher, I had an opportunity to really develop deep relationships with. And so I'm sort of jealous of some of these tools, because I do see how how they might help to support those relationships. Sharon, is that something that you're seeing in the school district as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can attest that the walls have come down in learning through this, and I had the opportunity to go into some Zooms, and during the winter holidays, when the students are making Christmas trees or the Canara, when we're celebrating different cultural festivities, you could see the parents there as well with the materials, because teachers have delivered the bags of materials. So when they say, pick a color construction paper, or let's make our tree, or let's make our Canara, the parent is right there with the student, if they're available to help out with the student. So it has really become a whole family activity with a lot of the learning that's taking place in the classrooms.
That's great. Laura, anything you want to add on the question of technology's role in schools?
Yeah. So, I think that I see it as a positive, and as I said, like something that I hope continues, but I think it's also important to recognize there's still such limited access, broadband access and Wi-Fi connectivity that needs to be addressed to really be able to engage, more regularly, particularly in rural communities, and even, with families who have lower incomes. Like, you can't do a lot of things just on a cell phone. And so that technology and the connectivity are real issues. And so I think federal investment in that, broadband infrastructure is important. But so I hope to really continue to see that. And one I think earlier in the pandemic that I heard from a program was the digital format using Zoom brought in more participation from fathers who weren't as much engaged previously. So I don't know if that's been seen by others, but I thought that definitely was a silver lining thing that I had heard.
Yeah, I think I might have mentioned it on a prior one of these sessions, but was talking with a friend recently who runs a home visiting program, and had made the comment to them, oh gosh, the pandemic must have really taken a bite out of your ability to connect with families using this model where they were typically visiting in the home, and was very surprised to find that their feeling was really just the opposite, that it was a difference in the way they were connecting, but that they were finding that families were in some ways far more willing to connect and participate using technology than having visitors in the home. So lots of great opportunities. I want to shift our focus here a little bit to the question of social and emotional development for these kids. I think one of the great benefits of having a preschool experience, for example, is the opportunity to interact meaningfully and develop some of those executive functioning skills alongside your age level peers. And we recognize that for a lot of kids, that may not be the case coming into school this year, that even if they have had prior preschool experiences, that it may have been quite some time at this point since they were in sort of a classroom-based setting. Sharon, let me turn to you and ask, how are you preparing teachers, or what guidance would you give to teachers now, knowing that we've got an incoming class of kids who have experienced a stressful and an unusual year, but also a year that might have prevented them from having some of the kinds of peer interactions that they would have typically had?
So what we're doing, I mean, just as we do with our students, is offering choice for the professional development. And so it's putting a survey out to the needs of those teachers. Some may be, better proficient with the technology because we do have cameras in our kindergarten centers and webcams. Some may already, have experience with that. So then we want to go into maybe more about self-care of themselves so that they can better be prepared to teach students, or the social emotional learning, or learning about adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, and the trauma informed. And so what we do is try to offer a menu of options for professional development versus one size fits all, because we do know, every teacher has different, different experiences themselves, and we don't want to just pigeonhole them into a one size fits all. So just as we do with kids, we offer professional development and in different modes. So some virtual, some in person, during their planning time, those that are in the building. So we do offer that array for teachers to be able to support their needs as well, so that they can become, proficient in a skill that they're looking forward to doing.
Definitely. And I think, Sharon, the first time you and I ever had a chance to speak was actually on a panel. Gosh, it's probably been a year ago now, that we were talking about some of these same issues a year ago during the pandemic. Yep. And one of the big takeaways from that we subsequently did some writing about was this idea of Maslow before Bloom, right? Definitely. That Maslow talked about the hierarchy of needs and the children's need for safety before they're going to get to that kind of Bloom's taxonomy level of different levels of learning. What guidance what would you say is most important for teachers sort of to remember as they start with this new crop of kids?
I would definitely say, and I've been reading more about it, and it's the culture of care. I think just their presence of showing up and being there consistently and carving out that time to build resiliency, because we do know students are resilient. But when we're talking about all of the guidelines that we have to adhere to, it's remembering to transform those guidelines to kid-friendly terms, meaning, and I know I've seen, airplane arms, when you're with your peers, airplane arms, the signs that we have, making them kid-friendly, and then at kids' eye level, putting down the markers on the floor. We have a lot of the mascot on the floor. So you're still incorporating the learning, counting the mascots and the marks on the floor and looking at the signs, incorporating the learning, also using the mitigation strategies to keep students safe. So I think also with the culture of care, it's for our staff. And I've seen just a plethora of activities that have just been in place just to have staff laughing and taking care of themselves so that they could be there for students. But I think, if I had to just zero on one thing, it's just through that transitioning, transforming the information so that it's developmentally appropriate and making sure that kids are part of that and that they understand it, but making it kid friendly.
Kathy, let me turn to you and ask a little bit of the same question. How are you guiding your teachers in terms of the needs of kids and their social emotional development during this kind of stressful time?
We're including our mental health consultants to work closely with us and also work closely with our teaching staff. Before we started to enroll children for this next school term, we had a boot camp, professional development camp, and it provided teachers with how to work with children to learn during this pandemic. And it had topics like building trauma-informed classrooms, conducting effective virtual home visits, teletherapy for children with diagnosed disabilities, the impact of trauma on behavior, creating virtual activities for young children. So they spent 20 to 30 days before any activities, just building their confidence and their abilities on how to enforce this in the classroom, how to work with children who, because trauma is a part of what's happening with the pandemic, not only with the children, with the parents also. So we also work with our family engagement staff. Also, we have what we call Mindful Matters, and that's every Monday for the staff. They have a session where they do relaxation kinds of therapy. They are able to share and talk to each other about activities. We talk about how do we cope with grief, stress, balancing our life. So every Monday, staff can join into these conversations. And we also can have individual sessions with our mental health persons. If something goes deeper than just working it out through a group, we have mental health consultants that they can talk one-on-one on. These services are also offered to our parents. We do have mental health services. We have groups, parent groups that they can have conferences with the mental health consultants. So trying to work through those kinds of things, because we've seen, stress, depression, people, they lost their jobs, they lost loved ones, helping children to deal with death and those kinds of things. We're really looking at that. So we have a plan, professional development days. We have those days where Mondays, and then once a month to reinforce with our teachers, because it's so important that our teachers have an understanding and they're sensitive to what our families have gone through, as well as understand their challenges, because our teachers have lost loved ones. They've had the virus. So we have once a month, a mental health person is available to have conversations, to talk about, do workshops on grief and dying, how to work through those kinds of things. Anything that the staff may need, we have that person there to kind of guide them. If we cannot provide the service directly, we make connections for referrals in the community. So we realize we have to focus on the social emotional development of our staff, our parents, and our children.
That's great. Laura, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on the question of social emotional development in transition. It's so interesting that if we were to ask a group of people walking down the street what they felt like was most important for an incoming kindergartner, they might talk about the alphabet and counting and that sort of thing. But when we talk to teachers, it's interesting that they almost always will hone in on the social emotional questions and the development of those executive functioning skills, the opportunity to share and take turns and follow directions and so on. How are you seeing this upcoming year from a social emotional standpoint?
Yeah. Well, I really loved Sharon's emphasis on the culture of care for both, children and families and educators. I think that's so important because, certainly the content and the, skills that children learn and, traditionally in pre-K or in kindergarten are important, but that social emotional piece, the building skills to persist at challenging tasks, to be, resilient are so important. And I think that, certainly coming back, for this next school year, that's going to be all the more important. And so just as much as, we need to support children and families, we need to support teachers. And so I think, the focus that both Kathy and Sharon talked about for educators, I think is, with the professional learning, but also like their access to, mental health resources or to support each other is so good to hear, because in order to support and like model, strong social emotional behaviors for kids, teachers themselves have to be in, really good places emotionally as well to do that. I think one of the most important things I think on my mind this for this next school year is having reasonable expectations. And I think also about, first grade because there might be places where kids aren't going to have kindergarten and they're going to go right into first grade, and or even traditionally places that have a lot of pre-K for kids coming into kindergarten. They're not going to have, they've been away from a year. They might have not had those experiences, or they just have been away from them a year. So the idea of, expectations around sitting for extended periods of time, or for sharing, or for waiting their turn, or for walking in a line. I think those things are going to have to be remodeled, retaught, and I think those expectations need to be in place for to give space and time for that from the beginning, and for building community in the school and building strong relationships in the classroom. Because if kids don't feel like they have a trusted adult, if they don't feel like the expectations are reasonable for them, then they're just not going to be able to get to where you said at the very beginning, to the Bloom's taxonomy, to really get into learning and recovering learning that they might have missed out on during this past year.
Sure, and there's an interesting question in the Q&A here in the chat that I wanted to run past you, and the person is saying that it's been especially challenging this year to convince parents that they should not hold their children back, right? That parents are saying, well, you know, my child has missed so much. They missed a pre-K year, for example, and you know, we're having conversations now about holding kids out or you know, preventing them from going on to the first grade. How is the school district handling that conversation this year, recognizing that, you know, lots of kids have missed lots of experience? Are you giving flexibility to parents to sort of select where their kids are going, or are you trying to keep them together with age level peers as they would, you know, given their individual birth dates?
Certainly, I mean, we take it case by case, and we know parents know their kids best, but we do encourage to keep them with their peers. You know, I always bring up Leo, the late bloomer, and I say, in this case, we're all Leo late bloomers, you know, and we're all in it together. So I try to you know, highlight the fact that while they think their student has lost or needs extra time, that we're all making sure that we're having purposeful planning and intentionality when we are putting the lessons together, knowing that all students we've had hybrid learning models, and so that it's not just this student or that student, but we are listening to parents, and we're taking feedback from them and not just kind of dismissing. We're listening and we're hearing what they're saying, and then getting our professionals, our ED, our psychologists, our counselors together to look at the case, you know, case by case, to make those decisions together in partnership with the families.
And I'd imagine that, you know, every year this is the case, but that this year in particular, there may be, you know, a need to really work closely with teachers. I think, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about the school readiness of children, but less time talking about the school readiness of schools and their ability to sort of meet learners where they are and be prepared. And so, you know, I would imagine that in districts across the country this year, there's going to be a lot of conversation, you know, whether it's with kindergarten teachers or first grade teachers, or high school teachers. And, you know, in some cases, you know, lots of kids have missed out on in-person instruction. So I think it'll be more important than ever, the teachers, both within early childhood and beyond, you know, really be ready to meet learners where they are. Is that, Laura, is that sort of consistent with your work in school transition?
Yeah, I absolutely think that that's going to be so important. And I think that, you know, asking and understanding where families are and you know, I think is going to be really important this year. Like I said at the beginning, you know, without knowing where children and families are in this past year, it'll be harder to meet, you know, children and families where they are. So when we think about transition and like registration for kindergarten, I think, you know, questions about like this past year are going to be all the more important to having that, you know, information as early as possible.
Want to shift a little bit, I mean, to a broader transition question that, you know, that is certainly applicable this year in maybe some special ways. But maybe Kathy can start with you. And that's, you know, I mentioned earlier that, you know, that Head Start has strong transition practices woven all across its programming. And so wanted to talk to you a little bit about how your program works sort of to connect with local school districts, for example, and sort of bridges from the Head Start setting into the kindergarten setting that they may be going into. How do you work effectively with the schools? And maybe I'll throw in another question, because there's a question related to this in the chat, and that is, what do you do if you encounter a school or maybe vice versa that isn't interested in having a lot of connection with a community-based program?
Well, we do intentionally efforts to make sure that we partner with our local school districts through other working really hard together and developing positive relationships. And sometimes that's difficult, but you don't stop trying. You continue. You find that one person that can open the door for you and work through that way. We have written MOUs with all of our school districts. I'm in 20 counties, and those they don't all look alike. They're not rubber stamped. For each district, it's individualization based on what's expected of those school districts and our expectations for our children and families to make sure that they are school ready. We work closely to look at what's expected from the public school when children transition, and what we are doing so that we can align that. We align our curriculums. We look at that. We take recommendations. We also develop a school readiness team. So in each of those districts, we have school readiness teams where the school staff participates with us, and we're along with families to talk about the data that we've collected on children, the assessments and those kinds of things, and making recommendations and referrals for children who need extra attention. We also transfer some of the assessment data. Whatever the school decides, the information that we collect that they can use, we do that also. So a lot of individualized planning is built around not just children with disabilities, but for all children. So like I said, each of those agreements, those are written agreements. When we each participate, we meet every year to look at the agreements, but we also meet twice a year to just have conversations about where we're going. So with those school readiness teams, that gives us the opportunity to continuously discuss what's expected of children, where children are, so they can see. A lot of times we try to do more individualized with children, not just groups of children, because all children have different types of needs. So we work through that process also, and continue to keep our parents engaged in what's going on with their children. So like I said, if you have difficult school district or difficult Head Start program, you try to identify those resources that can help you penetrate that. Because the major goal, I think when we look at the goal, is for our children to learn and grow. And we have different approaches to that. So we need to have conversation about what is expected, what is Head Start responsibility, what is the public school responsibility. And if you intentionally meet and talk about that and focus on the needs of the children and families, then it works out. It works out. Like I said, we have different levels of communication with our different school districts, but we continue working to build and strengthen those to keep parents engaged so that they know too what's going on with what we're doing. So that's very important. So, I pick up the telephone, I call my partners. As executive director, I'm engaged with those partners just like the education director. So we meet, we have conversations. Now we're doing a lot of Zooms, but certainly we're still meeting and talking about the situations and where children are going. They're equally concerned about the social emotional development, the things that children have missed out on. So we're hoping that we can bridge those gaps by having those conversations and sharing information so they can see what it is that we did with the children when we had them this year, because it's quite different than what we did last year.
Sharon, let me let you weigh in on that from a school district perspective. How are you connecting with the Head Start and the child care and other preschool providers in your community to help facilitate these transitions?
Well, we wanted to take a proactive approach. We knew that coming out of virtual and going into hybrid, that there would be a need for our students to be in child care centers more, just because parents were working. So what we did, we set up a cadence of meetings with a representative from each of the child care centers in our community so that we could front load them with what our learning model is going to look like before we do it. What is the communication going to look like? What are the lessons going to look like? Because we didn't want parents to be that liaison between the school and the child care center. We wanted to talk directly to them so that they could know kind of what we were doing, and then in turn, what we could do to help. For example, some of our child care centers had multiple grades, in one big great room. And so while we knew students would have headphones on, we tried to modify our schedule so that everyone had a lunchtime the same time. Everyone had a recess break the same time. So the childcare providers wouldn't be trying to juggle, 5 different schedules at a time under their roof. So it was having those cadence of meetings so that they knew what our schedules were. And then we could listen to them to say, what is their structure of the day? And then we could kind of, change and transform our schedules so that we could meet in the middle and have it work both ways. But we definitely didn't want parents going there trying to remember, what we were doing and vice versa, and just to add that on their plate. So we tried to take that away and talk directly to the centers and continue that communication on a frequent basis so that we could update them as we're changing our models.
Elizabeth's got an interesting question in the chat, and maybe Laura will throw it out to the group, but maybe I start with you because I wonder if in your recent work on transition, if you've run across anything. But she's asking, how do you evaluate whether transition activities are working, and how might those evaluation methods have to sort of adjust during the context of the pandemic? As you were pulling together your work on school transition, are there standardized tools or other ways that you would suggest that the districts look at transition?
I don't know of standard tools, but I think that through one way is to get how well families felt transitioned is through things of around surveys. Did they feel like there was a smooth transition for their children? I think also evaluating things because like I said at the outset, thinking about transition as both the one moment in time or the short-term moment in time when, children and families are entering kindergarten, but also this, larger sort of systems work or around like connecting the dots between children's experiences before and after. And so when I think about that, I think about, do principals at schools have some kind of relationship or understanding about where many of their children come from, the child care centers or the Head Start programs, and what are those relationships like? Are there data sharing agreement kinds of things in place? Is there an MOU with a Head Start program, which we know has long been a Head Start requirement under the Head Start Act, but is a more recent requirement on the school district side through the Every Student Succeeds Act to have that reciprocal transition MOU with Head Start programs. And there's also the encouragement in there to also do that with other early childhood programs, which is so important. So I think looking at those pieces around alignment, and there are frameworks to look at that, like the one from the National P3 Center, looking at alignment and whether how it's connected, matching against that framework. So that could be one way to do some beginning evaluation.
Sharon and Kathy, I don't want to belabor the question because we've got several others that I want to try to get to as well. But anything either of you wanted to add about ways maybe that you're looking at sort of how you evaluate the success of these transition programs?
I think the outcomes for children when they're transitioning, and also we meet twice a year to look at what's expected and if we reach those goals. So the school district and Head Start meets twice a year, kind of look at the goals we have and if those goals have been met. We also, at the end of the year, meet to see how we can improve the planning, the transition planning, and those kinds of things. So constant conversations and looking at how the turnout for children, parent questionnaires to see how they felt it went for them and their child. That's very important too.
Yeah, and we utilize surveys, just, I know both Laura and Kathy mentioned this, but just surveying, we've partnered with Panorama, who has, conducted surveys in our school district about how parents are feeling, what their needs are, and then taking that information and then putting things in place from that.
So a really interesting question in the chat, and one that I think doesn't get a lot of attention in this conversation. So the question is, once children leave your program, what, if any, sort of follow-up is there to see how those children are progressing in their, at the next level after they've left your program? Is that something that obviously it's probably easier to do at the school district level, maybe to keep up with as kids are, progressing through what is ultimately kind of the same big public program. But Kathy, do you have any ways of sort of, after that transition out of Head Start has occurred to formally keep up with the needs of those families?
We do with parent permission, do some follow through and individual scores and information on children is shared. We also have a state project that we are collecting data on children who leave Head Start altogether. But working with our partners, we do have conversations. With parent permission, we collect data on how they're sometimes with their social emotional status, they have disabilities, how they're doing, their education status, and those kinds of things. We have even partnered where if a child was having difficulty when they went to kindergarten, that we would afford our teacher that their child had, would have conversation with the kindergarten teacher, or they would make visits or have phone calls with the child to kind of see, helping that smooth transition work out for them. Some children, it's hard to be separated from the teacher that they had before. So we look at that on an individual basis, what children need individually.
Sharon, anything you want to add on how the school district might sort of track kids over time?
Well, we follow the data. So we want to make sure that our data team looks at the cohorts that go through, especially for this year. I mean, knowing we're going into summer, we're making big plans for expanded learning and putting kinder camps in place, but we don't want to look at this as one isolated event. So we want to continually, before this, we always looked at our cohorts to make sure we're moving the needle on students and making sure the things and the interventions that we put in place were working. So it's just tracking and using our data teams to be able to track students and look at their data to see, what's working, what's not, so we can always revamp each year.
Kathy, there was a question in the chat about the school readiness teams that you mentioned are happening within your program. Can you talk a little bit more about those and sort of who they entail and what the work of the school readiness team is?
Okay, the school readiness team consists of Head Start staff, public school staff, and parents. And then other persons may be pulled into that. And we look at the data that we get on children, we analyze it, look at that data. They also make recommendations for follow-up. We've developed school readiness goals. We look at the expectations of the public school and look at our curriculums and align our curriculums, all those things that match. We look at development of appropriate practices for children, and if we're implementing those appropriately, just a whole look at our whole school readiness plan that we have in Head Start. And it can look different, different things are expected from different school districts. So we looked at what is realistic to expect for children. And we focus on making sure that we take children, we talked about it a few minutes ago, where they are. We start where they are, and then we move from that perspective. And that is so important because we know all children can learn. They all don't learn the same thing at the same time. We're working through that process and understanding how we teach children and how what's expected of our school districts. A lot of things, some things are expected that we might not think are most appropriate, but they're still expected. One of those things is walking in a straight line. Most schools expect children to walk in a straight line. And for many reasons, I understand some of the reasons they expect that now. For health and safety reasons, sometimes they're in halls with bigger kids, they could get lost in those kinds of things. So during our transition time, we practice those things that we may not practice all year. When we start to get children ready to go to public school, to go to kindergarten, those expectations are important because if children can't do those things, sometimes the part about them learning is missed because they're not able to do the straight line, they're not able to hold a tray, they're not able to do these, they don't know about a lunch ticket. So we start to practice those activities based on a recommendation from our school readiness team, how to really prepare children for that next transition. And then agreeing that we may not always agree that it's most appropriate, but sometimes it's expected. And if you don't have children where they're not doing what's expected, what's most appropriate or what they know get lost in the shuffle. So that school readiness team really work closely with our education staff, which is inclusive of health, mental health, and disability services and nutrition. So I work closely with that staff and our family and community engagement.
That's great.
And you have one from, we have like 6 areas. With 20 counties, there are 6 areas. So kind of working in that area kind of thing, but trying to get representatives from each school so that we have an understanding. And also for schools to understand what we're trying to do. That's important. Because sometimes that they don't understand. So just having great communication about what we do.
That is definitely key. Albert asked an important question in the chat. Obviously, the states are now in the process of putting together plans for how they're going to use billions and billions of dollars in American Rescue Plan dollars to support early childhood and child care infrastructure. Are there any places, if you could wave your magic wand and have some of that money directed to support school transition, any resources that you would see as particularly useful if the states were to dedicate some of their money in that direction?
I certainly would see that. Improving the communication piece, getting technology tools that are needed to families, internet accessibilities for those rural areas where you can barely get anything from, making extra efforts to get those kind of connections for our families. More mental health services, focus towards the positive, not necessarily the negative, but helping parents learn to cope, working with children who need that extra push, and working with teaching staff who needs to be more sensitive and more responsive to our children as they come now, because they have missed a lot. And we can't be playing the catch-up game because we can't catch up. We have to start where we are. So that would be great.
Laura, I know you obviously reviewed these transition practices. Are there things that you might identify that are on your wish list maybe for the states as we go about looking at how to spend some of these new federal dollars?
Yeah, I think more state support of alignment, at the local level, whether it's holding up places in the state that are doing well, and around creating these relationships across systems. I think the state can play a role in convening, so learning from good work that's happening in one place and spreading that across the state, and even at the state level, using some of those dollars to think about how to bring people together and model at the state some connections and collaboration, and bringing together the early childhood communities with the elementary schools. Like, I think that could be beneficial. And then putting some attention on just what I would say is rethinking, what's happening in kindergarten, strengthening and making more appropriate discipline strategies, providing, professional development, making that a priority at the state around that, to just have more appropriate expectations for what's going on in kindergarten.
Sharon, we'll give you the last word. Any thought on how this new federal investment might help to support kids as they're transitioning into your system?
I mean, similar to what Laura and Kathy said, I think, work so that we can prioritize what's necessary as far as academics, but I think more so on the social emotional learning and the mental health aspect of training our staff so that we can be there for students, and also wraparound services for our families.
That's terrific. With that, we are just about out of time, so I want to take a moment and sort of wrap us up and extend our thanks to this terrific panel. Dr. Sharon Pepakayu, who is the Associate Superintendent of the Appoquinimink School District in Newcastle County, Delaware. Dr. Kathy Gaston of Friends of Children of Mississippi. Thank you, Dr. Gaston, for being with us. And Laura Bornfriend, who is the Director of Early and Elementary Education at New America in Washington, D.C. I want to share with you quickly, if I can pull it up here and see if I can screen share. Bear with me for a moment. Technology. Here we go. wanted to share with you just a couple of upcoming opportunities for programming from the Hunt Institute. This coming Thursday, we have an opportunity. It is a little outside of the early childhood world, but our post-secondary pathways series is going to be doing a great session later this week on Thursday on building coalitions of support for higher education. And then we've got two great upcoming early childhood sessions. One a week from today, which will be moderated by Albert Watt of the Alliance for Early Success, who is with us in the chat today. We're going to be looking at post-COVID-19 kindergarten readiness in our Homeroom with Education Leaders series. Dr. Kathy Hoffman, Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Arizona, and Dr. Ryan Stewart, who is New Mexico's Secretary of Education, will be with us. And then in early May 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be talking about the early childhood workforce and creating equitable pathways for advancement within that workforce. We'll be talking with Lynette Dumas, who is the Executive Director of the National Association of Family Childcare, Dr. Calvin Moore of the Council for Professional Recognition, Lauren Hogan from NACCE, and Karen Ponder, who is a Distinguished Fellow with the BUILD Initiative, but also the recent chair of the Power to the Profession Task Force will be with us to have that important conversation about the needs of the early childhood workforce. Hope you can join us for one or all of those upcoming sessions. Again, I want to take a moment to thank our three terrific panelists today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, and thank all of you. Again, we recognize that for many people, this is sort of a holiday week being spent with family, and so thank you in particular for taking time out to spend time with us this afternoon. It's great to be with you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everyone.